In the spring of 1887, in the low cypress country of the Atchafalaya Basin, a young woman stood ankle-deep in black water and put her hand against a cabin door that 3 men had told her would not be worth the rope to pull it down. The water moved against her boots, slow and brown and patient the way that water has of waiting out everything built on top of it. She did not move her hand. She had paid $4 for the cabin and the quarter-acre of muck it stood on, and the men at the parish land office had laughed when she signed her name because they knew what she did not yet seem to know, that the swamp took back whatever the swamp was lent. What none of them knew, and what she only suspected, was that the man who built this cabin had hidden something in it worth more than the whole dry town that laughed at her. Her name was Delia Marsh, and she was 28 years old, and she had come to the basin with a carpet bag, a leather roll of her father's tools, and almost nothing else. This is a story about what patience finds when cleverness has stopped looking. Stay with it, and you will see a thing buried for a long time come up into the light. The water did not care about any of that. The water only rose and fell with the season, and that spring it was falling, and the falling was about to show her what it had been hiding. Delia had not chosen the basin out of romance. She had been put out of a dry goods house in Baton Rouge, where she had kept the books and mended the stock, put out when the owner's son decided a woman who could read a ledger as well as he could was a danger to his standing. She had been given a week's wages and the suggestion that she find work more suited to her. She had taken the wages, and she had taken the train as far south as the wages would carry her, and at the end of the line she had heard about the parish selling off the forfeited lots in the flooded country for whatever a body would pay. What she carried that mattered was not money. It was the leather tool roll, soft and dark with 40 years of her father's hands, and inside it the chisels and the small mallet and the marking gauge and the spoke shave that her father had taught her to use before she was tall enough to see over his bench. Henry Marsh had been a joiner and a maker of fine cabinets and natches until the lung sickness took him and he had no son, and so he had taught his daughter the way he would have taught a boy, with no allowance and no softness, because he said the wood did not care whose hands held the tool, only whether the hands knew their work. He had told her one thing: she carried like a coin in the mouth. He had said that any man who builds a hiding place builds it the way he builds everything else. That a careless man hides things carelessly, and a careful man cannot help but be careful, even in his secrets. And that if you wanted to find what a careful man had concealed, you did not look for the seam. You looked for the place where the work was too good for what it pretended to be. She had not understood it as a child. She understood it now. Standing in the black water, with her hand on a door, because the door was too good, that was the thing the laughing men had not seen. The cabin was half sunk and rotted along its lower logs, the roof gone soft and green, the whole of it leaning toward the water, like a tired animal. The door under her hand, though, was cypress, and it was hung true, and the joints of its frame were cut with a tightness that no swamp squatter would have wasted on a place like this. Somebody who knew wood had built that door. Somebody who knew wood does not waste a fine door on a hovel unless the door is guarding something. The auctioneer in the parish seat had been a heavy man named Pruitt, and he had read out the lot in a voice already laughing. He had said the cabin came with no road, no landing, and no future, that the last man to own it had drowned or run off, nobody recalled which, and that the young lady was welcome to it if she could find it. The room had been close and hot, smelling of tobacco and damp wool, and the dozen men gathered along the benches had turned to look at her the way men look at a thing that has wandered in by mistake. She had stood very straight and named her price in a clear voice, $4, and a ripple of laughter had gone along the benches, and Pruitt had brought his little hammer down with a flourish as if disposing of a joke rather than a deed. The 3 men, leaning on the rail, had found this very fine. One of them, a land agent named Boudreau, who bought up the dry parcels and sold them to timbermen, had touched his hat to her and said that he would give her $2 for it that very afternoon, sight unseen, to save her the trouble of going. He was a smooth, well-kept man in a pale linen coat, with rings on 2 fingers and a watch chain that caught the light, and he spoke to her with the particular gentleness that powerful men reserve for those they have already decided are no threat. She had thanked him, and declined. She had seen the way he watched her decline, the small tightening at the corner of his mouth that did not match the ease of his voice, and she had filed it away, because a man does not offer to buy back worthless mud unless the mud is not as worthless as he is telling everyone. A man who shrugs at a loss does not follow it into the swamp. A man who smiles while his eyes go flat is doing arithmetic. It took her the better part of 2 days to reach the cabin. She hired a pirogue and a boy named Theo to pole it, a thin, watchful boy of perhaps 14, who knew the channels and said little, and they went in through a country of drowned trees where the light came down green and broken, and the herons stood like gray priests in the shallows. The boy read the water, the way she read wood, by signs invisible to anyone who had not spent a life at it, turning the narrow boat down channels that looked to her like solid weed and finding open water on the other side. He did not laugh at her. Theo looked at the tool roll in the bottom of the boat, dark and soft with use, and asked once whether she meant to fix the place or rob it, and she said neither, that she meant to read it, and the boy seemed to find this an acceptable answer and poled on, and a great blue heron lifted ahead of them and beat away low over the water with its legs trailing. The first night she slept in the boat under an oiled canvas, and the basin spoke all around her, the frogs and the slow suck of the water at the cypress knees, and once far off the cough of something large. She was not afraid in the way the men had wanted her to be afraid. She had been put out of a town by a clever man, and she had learned that the things people teach you to fear are most often the things they want to keep for themselves. She lay awake under the canvas with the coal tools in their roll beside her like a row of sleeping hands, and she watched the smear of stars through a gap in the cypress, and she thought about the door hung so true on a ruin, and she thought about her father's coin in the mouth, the place where the work is too good for what it pretends to be. Somewhere in the dark, Theo turned in his sleep, and the water moved, and the night went on being patient in the way that water is patient. What she did not yet know was that the cabin had been built by a man whose work the whole basin had reason to remember, and that the falling spring water was even then drawing back from a thing he had sunk beneath his own floor, a thing that would set a long account straight. In the morning she reached it. The cabin sat on a hummock of slightly higher ground, a swelling of black earth held together by the roots of a single great water oak, and around it the flood of the wet season was visibly retreating, leaving a tide line of dried scum on the lower logs and a smell of rot and green and old iron. She had Theo hold the pirogue against the door sill while she stepped up and in, and the floor took her weight with a groan but held, and she stood in the one room of the place, and let her eyes adjust and began in the way her father had taught her to read. The room told her several things at once. It told her that a careful man had lived here and that he had lived here alone, because there was one of everything, and all of it placed where a working hand would want it. A bunk built into the wall with dovetailed corners. No squatter would trouble to cut a shelf with the ghosts of jars. A workbench, and this stopped her, a real joiner's workbench bolted to the wall, with a face vise gone to rust, but a vise nonetheless, and in the swamp where no cabinet would ever be commissioned and no fine wood would ever come, a joiner's bench made no sense at all. A joiner had come here to hide. A joiner had come here to disappear, and had brought his bench because a man does not leave behind the thing that is his hands. She knelt at the bench and put her own father's tool roll on it, unrolled it, and the familiar weight of the chisels in their pockets steadied her. Theo watched from the door. She told him he could come in if he stepped where she stepped, and he came, careful as a cat, and crouched against the wall and watched her work, and over the next hours, as she went over the room, board by board, he began to hand her tools before she asked, having guessed already which one she would want. The floor was where the work was too good. The whole cabin had been thrown up of rough logs, bark still on some, the chink ain't crumbling, the kind of building any tired man might manage in a season. The floor, though, was laid of planed cypress boards, tongue and groove, fitted with a tightness that had survived years of damp without springing, and a man who could lay a floor like that could have built the entire cabin to the same standard and had chosen not to. He had spent his skill on the floor. He had spent it where a man's eyes do not go. She found the board on the second day. It was no wider than the others and no different to the eye, but when she set her palms flat and went along the floor pressing, the way she would test a panel for a hollow behind it, this board gave back a different sound, a deadness where the others rang faintly on the joists. She marked it with a pencil. Then she did not pry it up, because her father had also taught her that a careful man's concealment will have a way of opening that does not destroy it, and that if you go at it with a crowbar, you are telling the world a thief was here, while if you find the way it was meant to come up, you are only doing what the maker did. It took her most of that day to find it. The board had no nails. That was the first wrong thing, a floorboard with no nails in a nailed floor. She got down with her cheek nearly against the wood and went along the seam with a thin blade, feeling for the way it had been meant to come up, and the swamp light failed, and Theo lit a tallow stub and held it close, the small flame doubling in the damp grain of the cypress. Twice she thought she had it, and twice the blade only scraped. She made herself stop and sit back on her heels and breathe, because her father had told her that haste is how a careful job ruins a careful thing, that the hand in a hurry breaks what the patient hand would have opened whole. She ran the blade along its edges again, slower, and felt at one end the blade catch on something that was not wood, a small iron catch set flush into the groove. And when she pressed it with the tip of her father's marking, all the board rose a finger's width with a small dry sound, like a held breath let go. Beneath it was a box. Not a treasure chest of the kind the laughing men might have imagined, but a joiner's box, cypress, dovetailed. The lid fitted so close that the wet of the swamp had never reached inside, and she lifted it out and set it on the bench and stood looking at it for a long moment before she opened it, because she understood that whatever was inside had been put there by a careful man who meant it never to be found by a careless one, and that she was about to inherit, not a fortune, but a charge. Have you ever found a thing that someone hid and felt, in the finding, that you had been chosen to carry it the rest of the way? That is what she felt. Then she opened the box. Inside was no gold. Inside were papers, dry and brown and folded, and a smaller wooden case, and on top a single object wrapped in oilcloth that she unwound. To find a wooden plane, a smoothing plane of dark rosewood, with a worn brass adjustment and an inscription cut into the heel of it in small, clean letters. The inscription read, "To my friend Amos, who taught me to see the grain, from Henry M. She." Read it twice. Henry M. She sat down on the bunk and held the plane in her two hands, and the basin went very quiet around her, and Theo, watching, asked what was wrong, and she said after a while that the man who had built this cabin had known her father. The papers told the rest, and the rest was the thing the falling water had been keeping. The man who had hidden the box was named Amos Teal, and he had been, before the swamp, a furniture maker and a free man of color, who had kept a shop in the river town of Point Vert 2 days north, and who had been ruined and driven out by a campaign of forged paper that took his shop, his accounts, and finally his name. The papers in the box were his proof. They were the original deed to his shop and the land it stood on, witnessed and recorded, and beside it a second deed, a forgery, transferring the same property to a holding company for a debt Amos had never owed, and the two laid side by side showed the forger's hand plainly, because the careful man had kept the true paper and the false one together so that anyone with eyes could compare them. And the name on the holding company, the name that had signed the false debt into being and taken a free man's life's work for it, was Boudreau. She understood then why the land agent had touched his hat to her and offered $2 sight unseen. Boudreaux had not known exactly what Amos Teal had carried into the swamp, but he had known the man had carried something, and he had spent years quietly buying up every forfeited lot in the basin, every drowned acre, looking for the cabin of the joiner who had vanished rather than be hanged for a debt he could prove he did not owe. He had been looking for this box for a long time, and a young woman with $4 had walked into the land office and bought it out from under him before he found it. The smaller wooden case in the box held the other half of the charge. It held letters, a thin packet tied with faded thread, and they were letters from Amos to a daughter, a girl named Cora, who had been a child when the trouble came, and who had been sent away north to Ken in the free country before the worst of it, so that whatever happened to him would not happen to her. The letters were never sent. They were a father's account of what had been done to him, and a father's hope that one day someone would carry the truth to his child, that she would know her father had not run from a true debt but had been robbed by a false one, and that the proof of it was kept safe under a floor he had built with his own hands, in a place no clever man would ever lower himself to look. Delia sat with the letters a long time. The light through the doorway went from green to gold as the afternoon failed. Theo had gone out to the pirogue and come back with a string of bream and built a small fire on the hummock outside, and the smell of it came into her, and still she sat because she had come to the basin to read a cabin, and had found instead that she had been handed a man's whole life and the unfinished work of putting it right. She did not weep, and she did not rage. She had learned long ago that neither moved a single board. Instead, she did what her father would have done. She took stock. She had the true deed and the false one. She had a packet of letters naming a living man as a thief. She had a plane inscribed by her own father to the man whose innocence she now carried, which meant her father had known Amos Teal, had perhaps helped teach him, had certainly trusted him, and that the thread that had brought her to this cabin was longer and older than the $4 she had paid. And she had, sitting outside her door eating bream by a small fire, a boy who knew every channel in the basin and who had asked her, on the first day, whether she meant to fix the place or rob it. She meant to fix it, not the cabin. The account. The next morning she did not start back to the parish seat. She had Theo pole her north instead, 2 days up through the drowned forest toward Point Vert, because she had understood that the proof in the box was worth nothing in the hands of a stranger with no standing, and that she needed first to find the one person whose standing the proof could restore. She needed to find whether Cora Teal still lived, and where. The town of Point Vert sat on a bluff above the river where the high ground began, a town of brick and whitewash that had grown fat on cotton and timber, and Boudreaux's name was on the bank, and on the land office, and on the long warehouse by the landing. Delia did not go to any of those. She went to the oldest part of the town, the back lanes where the people lived who remembered things the new brick wished forgotten, and she asked, quietly, after the family of a furniture maker named Teal who had kept a shop there years before. She found an old woman named Sister Reed, broad and slow and sharp-eyed, who had known Amos and who looked at Delia for a long moment before she would say anything, weighing her the way the swamp weighs a new thing dropped into it. The old woman sat on a cane chair in the shade of a chinaberry tree, shelling peas into a tin bowl, and she did not stop shelling while she looked, and the small, steady sound of the peas falling was the only answer Delia got for a while. Delia did not lie to her. She said she had bought a sunk cabin in the basin for $4 and found a box beneath the floor, and that the box held the truth of what had been done to Amos Teal, and that she had come to find his daughter. Sister Reed's hands went still over the bowl. Her face did not change, but her hands, folded now in her lap, tightened on one another, and after a long breath she said that plenty of white folks had come asking after the Teals over the years, and that not one of them had ever come bringing instead of taking. Delia said she had brought the box, and meant to give it. The old woman studied her a moment more, then said that Cora Teal was living, that she had come back south 2 years past and kept a laundry by the lower landing, and that she had spent those 2 years asking the very questions Delia was asking and getting doors shut in her face for them. Then she went back to her peas, which was her way of saying the talk was finished and the road was open. Cora Teal was a woman near Delia's own age, with her father's careful hands and her father's wariness, and when Delia laid the 2 deeds side by side on the ironing table and set the packet of unsent letters beside them, Cora did not touch them at first. She stood with her arms folded and asked who had sent her and what she wanted for it, because every person who had ever come to her with her father's name had wanted something for it. Delia said she wanted nothing. She said the box was Cora's by right, that it had been hidden by her father against this exact day, and that she had only carried it the last stretch of a road Amos Teal had started building under his own floor years before. Then she stepped back from the table, so that the papers were closer to Cora's hand than to her own, and waited. Cora read the letters first, not the deeds. She read them standing, and then she sat, and then she read them again, and, when she finally put her hand flat on the true deed beside the false one, it was the steady hand of a woman who has been told for years that she imagined the wrong done to her and has just been handed the iron proof that she did not. She looked up at Delia and asked in a voice gone quiet and level what they should do. They did not do it loudly. That was the whole of Delia's strategy, and it was her father's. And behind him it was Amos Teal's, who had laid his proof under a floor instead of shouting it from a gallows. A shout could be dismissed. A free man of color shouting theft against the richest man in the parish could be hanged for the shouting alone. The deeds, though, were paper, and paper went where shouting could not. The county had a recorder of deeds, an office that existed below the level of any man's power, because it served only the documents, and the forged deed Boudreau had used to take the shop was on file there, recorded in the county book in the forger's own confident hand. The true deed, witnessed and dated earlier, had never been filed, because Amos had been driven out before he could. It could be filed now, though they filed it. Delia and Cora together carried the true deed to the recorder's office, an old clerk named Mr. Corrid. Ainsley, who wore spectacles and cared for nothing in this world but the correctness of his books, and they laid the true deed before him and the certified copy of the false one beside it, and asked him only to do his duty, which was to record the earlier instrument and note the conflict. Mr. Ainsley looked from one to the other for a long time. The office smelled of dust and sealing wax, and the great county books stood in their ranks along the wall, and he was a small man among them, made small on purpose by a lifetime of serving things larger and more permanent than himself. He took the 2 deeds to the window and held them to the light, one behind the other, and his spectacles caught the glare, and he was quiet so long that Cora's breathing changed beside Delia. He was not a brave man, and he was not a crusader, but he was a precise one, and precision, once it sees 2 facts that cannot both be true, cannot rest. He said only that the dates did not agree, and that a date that does not agree is a thing he is obliged to enter. He recorded the true deed. He dipped his pen and entered the conflict in the margin in his small, exact hand, blotting it with care, and by doing only his narrow duty he set in motion a thing no shouting could have started, because now the county's own books contained the contradiction, and a contradiction in the public record is a worm that does not stop eating. Boudreau understood it before the town did. He was a clever man, and a clever man feels the floor shift under him faster than an honest one. Once only, in this account, we may look at what passed behind his face, and it was not remorse, for there was none in him, but the cold calculation of a man totting up which of his holdings rested on which forged foundation, and finding to his growing unease that he could not be sure any more which papers would bear weight. He had built his fortune the way a careless man builds, with hidden seams. and he had always trusted that no one would look beneath the floor. Someone had looked. He did not come for Delia with violence. Men like Boudreau do not, because violence leaves a mark on the record, too. He came with an offer. Dax. He sent word to the laundry by the lower landing that he wished to purchase certain old papers that had come into the lady's possession, that he understood there had been a misfiling, and that he was prepared to be generous in setting the matter to rest. He named a sum that was to two women who had between them a laundry and a sunk cabin, a great deal of money. Cora looked at the note and then at Delia, and Delia said the choice was Cora's alone, that it was her father and her name, and that no one in the world had the right to make it for her. Cora burned the note in the laundry stove. Then she went with Delia beside her to the one place Boudreau could not buy, which was Mr. Ainsley's office, and she filed, as the daughter and heir of Amos Teal, a formal claim upon the property, recorded under the true deed, and she did it in the open ledger where the whole county could read it, and she signed her father's name beneath her own. After that, it was only a matter of time, and the time was not long. A forged deed can stand for years in the dark, but it cannot stand for a week in the light beside the true one, with an heir's claim filed against it and a precise old clerk noting every conflict in the margin. The holding company's other titles came into question, because a man who is found to have forged one deed is asked suddenly about all the rest, and Boudreau had a great many rest. He did not stay to be asked. Within the season he had sold what he could quietly sell, at a loss, and gone west, and the long warehouse by the landing changed its name, and the bank found new officers, and the town went on as towns do, fatter on forgetting than it ever was on cotton. He was not hanged and he was not jailed. He simply became, as such men finally do, irrelevant, undone, not by a bullet, but by the weight of a single true paper that had waited under a floor for the right hands to lift it. The shop on the bluff came back to Cora Teal. It had been a feed store under the holding company, and it was a feed store still, rented to a tenant, but the deed to the land beneath it bore her name now, and the rent came to her, and with the first of it, she did a thing that Delia understood completely without being told. She had a sign made for the door, a plain wooden sign with no boast on it, only the name Teal, carved, because her father had been a man who carved, and she hung it where the forged name had hung for years. Delia did not stay in Point Verde. The town was Cora's to live in and to be known in, and Delia had found, in the doing of all this, that she did not want to be known. She wanted to work. She went back down into the basin to the cabin on the hummock under the great water oak, and she took the cabin apart and built it again, board by board. She did it through a long summer in the heat and the mosquitoes and the green stink of the low water, the rotted lower logs replaced with new cypress that Theo and a cousin of his cut and hauled and squared, the floor taken up and relaid true, the workbench freed of its rust with vinegar and a wire brush and oiled until the face vise turned sweet again under her hand. She found, prying up the old floor, the cavity where the box had lain, and she left it, lining it clean, because a shop should remember what it was before it was a shop. She did not build a fine house. She built a fine shop, because the swamp, it turned out, was full of cypress, the most rot-resistant wood in all that drowned country, the wood the old builders called everlasting, and a joiner who knew how to read the grain could make of it furniture that would outlast the brick towns, and there was no one for 100 miles who could do the work she could do. She kept Amos Teal's rosewood plane on the wall above the bench, the one inscribed by her father, and she used it. She did not keep it as a relic. Her father had taught her that a tool unused is a tool insulted, that the dead are honored by the work continuing and not by the work stopping. And so the plane that Henry Marsh had given to Amos Teal, and that Amos had hidden under a floor, came back into the daily use of hands that knew it. And the long curls of cypress came up off its mouth the way they had come up for the two dead men before her. The men in the parish seat did not laugh any more, though it would overstate the matter to say they came to admire her. Pruitt, the auctioneer, the next time business carried him into the basin, made a point of poling out to see the cabin, and he stood in his boat looking at the rebuilt shop, and the smoke from its chimney, and the stacked cypress drying under the oak, and he did not say he had been wrong, because men like Pruitt do not, but he took off his hat, which for him was the same thing. And Boudreaux's man, the one who had bought up the drowned lots, was gone with his master, and the lots themselves were just swamp again, worth $4 or nothing, exactly as they had always been, except for the one that had held the box. Theo became her apprentice. The thin, watchful boy who had asked whether she meant to fix the place or rob it turned out to have hands that wanted to learn, and she taught him the way she had been taught, with no allowance and no softness, because the wood did not care whose hands held the tool. She started him on the dull work, the planing of rough stock down to true hours of it, until his arms shook and the long curls came up even and unbroken, and only then did she let him near a joint that would show. She taught him to find the place where the work is too good for what it pretends to be. She taught him that a careful man cannot help being careful even in his secrets. And once, when he asked her why a man would hide the truth under a floor instead of carrying it to a judge, she set down her tool and answered him plainly that Amos Teal had not had a judge he could trust, that a man with everything against him had trusted instead the one thing that does not take sides, which is good work done honestly and kept safe for the day. The world is ready to read it. Cora came down into the basin twice a year, at the high water and the low, and the two women would sit on the rebuilt sill with their feet over the black water and say little, in the way of people who have done a large thing together and have no need to keep naming it. Cora brought on the second spring, a thing she had found among her father's effects that had been returned to her with the shop, a small daguerreotype in a case, and it was a portrait of two young men standing stiff beside a finished sideboard in a shop in Natchez, and one of them was Amos Teal as a young man, and the other was Henry Marsh, and on the back, said Delia's father's hand, were the words, Amos and me, the day we finished the governor's sideboard, two fools who could make anything. Delia kept it on the wall beside the plane. She thought sometimes about the men at the land office and the word they had used, the word that everyone in the dry towns used for a woman who paid good money for sunk ground. And she found that the word had stopped having any sting in it, because it had turned out to be the truest thing they could have said and the most wrong both at once. She had been foolish in their reckoning to want a thing the clever men had decided was worthless, and it was precisely because she wanted the thing the clever men had thrown away that the thing the clever men were hiding had come at last into her hands. The basin kept its slow accounts in its own way, taking and giving with the seasons, and Delia Marsh kept hers at the bench under the oak, and the years went down into the black water and did not come back up the way years do. She grew older there, Theo grew into a joiner as good as she was, and then, in time, better at certain things, which is the only reward a teacher is permitted to hope for. The shop's furniture went up and down the river, and into the brick houses of the towns that had laughed, and not one buyer in 100 knew that the cypress had come out of a swamp that had been sold for the price of a meal. On the last evening of this account, an old woman now, Delia, sat on the sill in the failing spring light, and the water was falling again as it fell every year, drawing back from the lower logs and leaving its tide line of dried scum and the smell of green and old iron that she had smelled the first day. When she was 28 and had put her hand against a door that was too good for the ruin it guarded, she reached up without looking and took the rosewood plane down from its pegs, and she set it on her knee, and she ran her thumb along the worn brass and over the small clean letters cut into the heel. To my friend Amos, who taught me to see the grain, from Henry M. The light went down gold over the drowned forest. Somewhere out in the channels a heron lifted and was gone. And the old woman sat with the plane in her two hands. In the shop her own labor had raised out of a thing the world had thrown away, and was content, in the grave and final way of a person who has lifted one true thing up into the light and seen it stay there. What would you have done if a swamp had sold you $4 of mud and you had found a man's whole life beneath it? Sit with that a while. And if this story stayed with you, there is another like it, waiting, of a thing buried and a patient hand that found it.